Israel has carried out an attack in the Lebanese capital, Beirut, that targeted a senior Hezbollah commander, the Israeli military has said. Protesters have taken to the streets again in Venezuela as opposition leaders are disputing the results of a weekend election that saw President Nicolas Maduro secure another term in power. A potential meeting between Chinese and Ukrainian leaders comes to the forefront as Ukraine on Tuesday invited the Chinese foreign minister for bilateral talks. Kamala Harris will announce a vice presidential pick as early as Monday before embarking on a multi-state battleground tour with her new running mate later in the week, as per multiple reports. The Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh has begun his 3-day state visit to India at the invitation of Prime Minister Modi. Well, our big focus, Israel has carried out an attack in the Lebanese capital, Beirut, that targeted a senior Hezbollah commander, the Israeli military has said. The Israeli military confirmed that its fighter jets eliminated Hezbollah's senior military commander, Fuad Shukr, during an airstrike in Beirut on Tuesday. The military actually accused Shukr of orchestrating a rocket attack on the annexed Golan Heights that resulted in the deaths of 12 young people. A loud blast was heard and smoke could be seen rising above the southern suburbs, a stronghold of the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah on Tuesday evening. But Lebanon's state-run national news agency said an Israeli air raid had targeted the area around Hezbollah Shura Council in the Har Hrik neighborhood of the capital, and at least one person has been killed. The Israeli military said it conducted a targeted strike in Beirut on the commander responsible for the murder of the children in Majd al-Shams and the killing of numerous additional Israeli civilians. Beirut, by the way, has been bracing for a potential Israeli attack since 12 people, including children, were killed in the rocket attack that I mentioned on Majd al-Shams in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights on Saturday.
In a targeted strike in Beirut, Lebanon, the IDF eliminated the man behind the Majd al-Shams massacre, Fuad Shukr. Shukr was a senior military commander in Hezbollah and the head of the strategic unit, and in the past 30 years, he has been responsible for masterminding, planning, and executing every Hezbollah attack. He has a $5 million bounty issued by the U.S. State Department on him, and he has the blood of civilians from all over the world on his hands. He was involved in numerous terrorist attacks, such as the U.S. Marine Corps barracks bombing that killed 241 American troops. His elimination brings us one step closer to restoring stability in this region and eliminating terrorists who threaten the lives of innocent civilians. We will take every step necessary to keep our civilians safe on all fronts.
For a quick update from Ground Zero, we have with us Voice of America's Jacob Russell, live from Beirut, Lebanon. Thanks so much, Jacob, for joining us for this live update. Has Israel disclosed how it determined the Hezbollah commander was killed or provide evidence of his death? And has Hezbollah commented yet?
I'm not hearing your question.
Sorry? Jacob, am I audible to you?
Yes, now you are. Now you're back. Yeah.
Perfect. I wanted to ask whether Israel has disclosed how it determined the Hezbollah commander was killed or provide evidence of his death. And has Hezbollah commented yet on Tuesday's strike in Beirut or whether Shukr died?
No, there is some confusion at the moment as to whether Shukr did die.
Right.
Israel has confirmed or in their original statement that he was killed. However, security sources in Lebanon have told Reuters that he survived the attack. And that was also confirmed to me by local sources. It is still early. Emergency workers are still working at the scene. It's not clear. At least one person has died so far. It's not clear who that person is. Hezbollah, everybody's waiting for a statement from Hezbollah, and I believe that will come today.
Right. Also, some say the Israeli messaging, Jacob, is that this was their promised response to the Majd al-Sham's attack and that they're not interested in more armed confrontation with Hezbollah beyond this. But what are you picking up on?
I think that very much depends on whether he was killed, in fact, because if he did escape the strike, then I don't think that the Israelis will consider that to be a satisfactory response to the Majd al-Sham's strike. It should be noted that Hezbollah deny involvement in the Majd al-Sham's explosion. So yeah, very much depends on whether Shukr was in fact killed or survived the attack. Otherwise, both sides are engaged in an extremely high stakes and extremely tense game of tit for tat, which as we saw in Majd al-Sham's, is liable to spill over at any moment.
Well, Jacob, thanks so much for joining us with that live update from Beirut. The strike also came as the international community has been urging restraint from both sides, fearing that an escalation on the Israel-Lebanon border could spark an all-out war. In fact, we have with us strategic affairs expert Brahma Chalani for further clarity on what's going on. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Now, the Americans and the French have tried to negotiate a way of de-escalating the Israel-Hezbollah border war. But does the absence of a ceasefire in Gaza blight their chances of success?
Gaza is just one of several wars that Israel is fighting at the moment. The war in Gaza against the Hamas, then there is a war against the Palestinians on the West Bank. There is an Israeli war against the Houthis in Yemen. There is an Israeli war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then there is Israel's shadowy war against Iran. So there are multiple war fronts for Israel. And the last thing Israelis want is the war against Hezbollah becoming an overt all-out war, because there is a war weariness in Israel. The war in Gaza has been so traumatic, not just for the rest of the world, but for Israelis too, because many Israelis have been displaced from border areas. I think 60,000 Israelis have been relocated from areas around Gaza. That's a large number of Israelis, given the fact that Israel is a country with a very small population. So given those realities, the last thing Israel wants, despite a war-prone Bibi as its prime minister, is an escalatory stance against Lebanon that leads to a full-fledged war.
In fact, many experts also echo the same views. Israel is also under heavy pressure, sir, from its allies, including the United States, without which it cannot sustain its war effort, not to take action that would actually escalate the war into an all-out fight.
Yes, and that's the reason why Israel carried out a single strike against this Hezbollah commander in Beirut. This was not the kind of reprisals that Bibi had threatened over that attack on the Golan Heights. By the way, there is no reason why the Hezbollah would strike a Druze village on the occupied Golan Heights. The Druze people have their roots in Islam. In fact, many Druze believe they are Muslim, though internationally the Druze are considered to be a distinct and separate religion. Hezbollah had no reason to attack that Druze village, but whatever may be the truth, the fact is that Israel's response has been quite pinpointed, not designed to escalate matters, and that clearly underscores the fact that Bibi, despite leading the most right-wing government in Israel's history, does not want to open another overt war front.
Right. In fact, experts have argued that the Israeli messaging is that this was their promised response to the Majd al-Sham's attack and that they're not interested in more armed confrontation with Hezbollah beyond this. But then there are other experts who argue the opposite. But sir, what is your perspective?
Israel lives in a very troubled neighborhood, just like India. It has enemies all around it, the way India has. And therefore, whatever Israel does, its regional environment will remain quite murky, and quite challenging for Israel's security. It's one thing to have these covert wars that are raging. It's another thing to turn these covert wars into raging, full-fledged wars, because the costs for Israel are going to mount.
Yes.
If a covert war becomes a full-fledged war, imagine the cost for Israel of the war in Hamas, against Hamas. The war against Hamas in Gaza, the devastation that has been caused in Gaza has shaken the conscience of the world. But there have been enormous costs that Israel is paying economically. Its own economy has taken a severe beating. The last thing Israel wants is another full-fledged war, this time against Lebanon. And Hezbollah, we should not forget, is a far better armed, far better trained adversary than the Hamas.
In fact, sir, recent days have also seen quite a few world leaders actually urge restraint over fears of an all-out war, right?
Yes, except that some of these very leaders who are urging restraint are the ones who have actually aided and abetted the Israeli war in Gaza. For example, the United States, under President Joe Biden, has very much been complicit the entire Israeli action in Gaza. So when, let's say, President Biden calls for restraint, his words don't carry much weight even among the present government leaders in Israel, because they know that they can get away with whatever they want. And they have in the recent months. They've gotten away by flouting what the Americans have been suggesting or even demanding. So I think that if world leaders want to really ensure that things don't go out of hand, they have to be more even balanced in their approach to this conflict. They have to ensure that while they support Israel, Israel does not cross a certain threshold by creating a humanitarian catastrophe of the kind that we are seeing in Gaza.
Certainly. It's always a pleasure to hear your viewpoint. Thank you so much, Brahma Chalani, for joining us on The World 24/7. With that, let's turn our attention now to Venezuela, where protesters have taken to the streets, holding marches and waving flags to demand President Nicolas Maduro acknowledge that he lost Sunday's election, to an opposition insisting it clinched a landslide victory. Now, the protests, which the government denounced as an attempted coup, began on Monday after the South American country's electoral authority declared that Maduro had won a third term with 51% of votes to extend a quarter century of socialist rule. The opposition, which considers the election body to be in the pocket of a dictatorial government, says its candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, had more than twice as many votes as Maduro based on the 90% of vote tallies it has been able to access. Now, at least 11 people have been killed in different parts of Venezuela since Sunday's election in incidents related to the count or associated protests. This is what right groups Foro Penal has confirmed. This opposition leader is battling to bring the curtains down on Nicolas Maduro's authoritarian regime. She has urged the Venezuelan strongman to accept that his exit from power is inevitable. Venezuela's President Maduro claimed victory in the country's presidential election, even as the country's opposition said its candidate Edmundo Gonzalez was the victor, and it had the polling to prove it. Maduro's claim of victory in Venezuela's presidential election has brought the South American country to a hazardous standoff, with his thwarted opponents accusing him of rigging the election to remain in power, and many leaders in the region and beyond questioning the veracity and transparency of the vote. The country's electoral authority said just after midnight on Monday that Maduro had won a third six-year term with 51% of the vote. The authority said Gonzalez won 44%, but opposition leader Maria Corina Machado said opposition candidate Gonzalez had secured 70% of the vote and that multiple independent exit polls and quick counts decisively showed his victory. Machado added the opposition has copies of about 40% of voting records. A long-time but low-profile member of the opposition, Edmundo Gonzalez, a former diplomat, was originally registered as a placeholder in March, after neither primary winner Machado nor her alternate were able to register. Machado then threw herself into campaigning for Gonzalez. Venezuelans have now taken to the streets after the Electoral Authority officially declared President Nicolas Maduro the winner of an election that the opposition says was marred by fraud. Demonstrators also toppled a statue of Maduro's predecessor Hugo Chavez in the state of Falcon. Public anger has swelled after the National Electoral Council formally confirmed that Maduro had been re-elected by a majority of Venezuelans to another 6-year term as president for the period 2025 to 2031. While Cuba and Bolivia have cheered Maduro's victory, Argentina's president called the official result fraud, while Costa Rica and Peru rejected it, and Chile said it would not accept any result that was not verifiable. Parmeshwar Bava for NDTV. Well, in other news, a potential meeting between Chinese and Ukrainian leaders comes to the forefront as Ukraine on Tuesday invited the Chinese foreign minister for bilateral talks. The invitation comes after Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba went to China last week, the first such visit since Russia's full-blown invasion of Ukraine in 2022. China has expressed interest in visiting. According to Ukraine, China has presented a neutral stance on the war between Russia and Ukraine, while maintaining ties with Russia and actually helping the country to keep its economy afloat. But the invitation from Ukraine comes as Russia announced that it captured an additional Ukrainian village on Tuesday. Russia describes the village as liberated, being one in a series of villages captured by the country in recent weeks. Meanwhile, US Vice President Kamala Harris will announce a vice presidential pick as early as Monday before embarking on a multi-state battleground tour with her new running mate later in the week. This is what sources familiar with the planning have confirmed. The high-stakes decision on who will run with Harris has taken center stage since she became the Democratic frontrunner for the 5th of November election after US President Joe Biden ended his White House bid just over a week ago. But Kamala Harris will announce a vice presidential pick before next week's tour of states that could swing to Republicans or Democrats in November. And news from home ground, Vietnam's Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh is visiting India to inject new momentum into the comprehensive strategic partnership between the two countries and to expand cooperation into new areas such as digital economy and renewable energy. This is actually the first visit by a Vietnamese premier to India in a decade, and also the first prime ministerial visit since the two sides upgraded their ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership back in 2016. But Mr. Chinh will be accorded a ceremonial reception at Rashtrapati Bhavan before he holds talks with Prime Minister Modi on the 1st of August. The two sides are expected to sign several agreements following the talks between the two leaders, and Mr. Chinh will also meet President Draupadi Murmu, Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar, and we're also informed that he will be meeting External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar as well. My colleague Mohammad Ghazali is tracking the Vietnamese Premier's visit very closely. He joins us with a live update at the moment. Ghazali, take us through the plan of action.
We have seen that how India is trying to expand its peace in the Southeast Asian region, and we saw Foreign Minister Mr. Jaishankar attending the ASEAN summit where he met the foreign ministers of all the Southeast Asian nations. But this particular visit is very significant as far as India's outreach in the neighborhood is concerned. And that is why, though India doesn't have any claim in the South China Sea, but Vietnam is already facing a kind of hostile relations there with China, with the maritime security and the movements in the South China Sea. And India is trying to stand with all those nations which have any kind of dispute in the immediate neighborhood. And that is why Vietnamese Prime Minister is visiting on a 2-day visit, and he will be meeting the President, the Prime Minister, and we will see a part of cultural diplomacy being played out between India and Vietnam, because in most of the nations, Buddhism is one religion which connects India with either Laos, with either Thailand, or a country like Vietnam. And Vietnam has also become a manufacturing hub. So, considering the kind of maritime movement India is looking for in the Southeast Asian region, Vietnam is certainly going to be a close partner for India. But besides that, digital economy, renewable energy, pharmaceutical industry, or the sector will be the key focus as far as the discussions are concerned. And in the last 1 week, if you see the India's foreign policy is concerned, the foreign minister has been to Quad, the foreign minister has been to the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Summit, and on both the occasions, the foreign minister was very clear as far as China's expansion or relations with China is concerned. So even in this ties, though India will be talking to Vietnam to bolster its ties, the bilateral trade is concerned, or issues related to the security is concerned. Since India talks about neighborhood first policy or India's Act East policy is concerned, considering these policies, the relations with Vietnam is very relevant, very significant. But besides that, in diplomacy, if you have to read between the lines, certainly China factor will be the one which will be under discussion between the foreign minister or Indian government dignitaries with the counterpart or with the Prime Minister of Vietnam.
As always, Ghazali, thank you so much for giving us the lowdown. We will, of course, revert to you for regular updates during the course of the Vietnamese Premier's visit to India. Welcome back. America's national debt topped $35 trillion for the first time on Monday, a reminder of the nation's grim fiscal predicament as legislative fights over taxes and spending initiatives loom in Washington. Now, on another note, the US Treasury reduced its estimate for federal borrowing for the current quarter and projected the government's cash buffer to decline towards the year-end, just ahead of a possible fresh fight over the debt limit. The leading presidential candidates, though, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump, have said little about the nation's deficits on the campaign trail, suggesting that the economic problem will only worsen in the coming years. Deep differences between Republicans and Democrats on policy priorities and resistance within both parties to enacting cuts to the biggest drivers of the national debt, which are Social Security and Medicare, have made it difficult to reduce America's borrowing.